to recording this session. We will get underway. All right, thank you everybody for being here for this latest presentation of the Chamber of Commerce's education series. We've got a great session today with Reeves Brown, who's going to tell us about the Gallagher Amendment. And I'm going to introduce Reeves here in just a moment. I do, again, want to thank everybody. Remind you that we are recording today, so by way of your registration, you will get a link to the recording of this session tomorrow in your email, and you can go back and reference that if there's something that you missed today. Folks who weren't able to join the call today will also be able to get a hold of it and watch it after the fact. We decided to do today's session as a regular Zoom call rather than a Zoom webinar. We do have the opportunity to do webinars, but we decided that we wanted today to be a little more interactive, so that's why we opted with the Zoom call model instead of the webinar. Did want to mention that the Broomfield Enterprise is our webinar partner. They are helping us to provide the webinar technology, our access to the webinar technology, so we appreciate their partnership on this. Also wanted to mention that our sponsor for today, if I can get my screen to change, our sponsor, well, it just ended. Our sponsor for today is Sunflower Bank, and a little bit of technical issue here. I'm gonna start that over again so you all can see that the Sunflower Bank is our webinar sponsor for today, and Kurt Sava is on the call with us as well. So Kurt, we appreciate your sponsorship and Sunflower Bank's sponsorship of today's event. And now we're going to get to Reeves Brown. I am, on behalf of Seth and the Chamber of Commerce, I'm pleased to introduce Reeves Brown to the members and guests of the Broomfield Chamber. Reeves is an independent public policy consultant and project manager for Building a Better Colorado. BBCO is a diverse, nonpartisan, nonprofit effort formed in 2015 by a group of Colorado civic leaders who shared a belief that Colorado can be better by engaging Coloradoans across the state in an honest conversation. BBCO does not advocate at all, not for any particular policies or legislation, nor for any candidates. Rather, it reaches out to diverse groups of community leaders across the state and conducts private forums to learn their views on certain key issues that it senses Coloradans may be prepared to address. Seth says it's been his pleasure to introduce Reeves to his Rotary Club, Denver Rotary Club, several times, and refer him to other Rotary clubs and chambers over the past few years. His organization's been doing research on some specific issues that were expected to come up in our upcoming election, namely the Gordian Knot, aka our state budgeting spending limits created by the Gallagher Amendment, the Tabor Amendment, and Amendment 23. As has happened in past years, parties independent of BBCO have organized to get a question on this year's ballot to effectively repeal Gallagher. Accordingly, today, Reeves will give us a primer on the Gallagher Amendment and what will happen if it is or is not repealed. In preparation for the election, Reeves and his team reached out to 1,800 civic leaders in 37 communities across Colorado. BBCO's research has a history of spawning ballot issues. In 2016, that included 3 ballot questions that passed by relatively wide margins, namely an increase in the requirements to amend our state constitution, reinstatement of a presidential primary, creation of a semi-open party primary elections. The bottom line is BBCO's research has had an impact and is likely to continue to do so. Reeves has served in Governor Hickenlooper's cabinet as an executive director of the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, as executive director of Club 20, which is a nonprofit political advocacy organization representing the diverse interests in Western Colorado, as executive director of the Colorado Cattlemen's Association, which allowed him to oversee the creation of Colorado Cattlemen's Agriculture and Land Trust. Reeves grew up on his family's 5th-generation cattle ranch in eastern Montana and received a BS in agricultural business with a minor in economics from Montana State University. Reeves and his wife have 4 children, a cat with an attitude, and a grateful heart for God's boundless grace. Reeves humbly notes that having spent his formative years working in and around cow manure, he feels he's adequately qualified to work in the area of public policy. And we want to reiterate that BBCO takes no position on the Gallagher ballot issue and will not be encouraging a vote either way, but you are encouraged to vote. So with that, Reeves, welcome. And I think I think with all that background, you can probably just jump right in.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pat. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to thank Seth Patterson too. Seth, as Pat mentioned, has provided an entree for me to present to his Downtown Rotary Club, as well as a number of other Rotary clubs. So Seth, thank you for your leadership there. appreciate the Broomfield Chamber's leadership in teeing this issue up and just raising awareness of it. And as Pat noted, Building Better Colorado is a non-advocacy group, so we don't recommend positions on proposed policies such as the Gallagher repeal proposal. We're just here to explain, but we are encouraged that the consensus recommendation that grew out of our statewide conversation last year is on the ballot for others to consider. So I'm going to share my screen here and go through a number of slides rather quickly in about hopefully about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So I'm going to explain what is the Gallagher Amendment. I'm going to explain how we expect the Gallagher Amendment to uniquely impact Coloradans in 2021 as a result of the current recession, and also going to explain the ballot measure to repeal the Gallagher Amendment and what that would or would not do. So to understand the Gallagher Amendment, you have to understand what property taxes are, because property taxes are all about, the Gallagher Amendment's all about property taxes. So property taxes are assessed locally. They are collected locally, they are spent locally, they entirely benefit local services. The state has no property tax. The state gets no benefit from property tax. The state hasn't had a property tax since 1964. And you can see from this pie chart that fully half of all property tax collections locally across the state benefit K through 12. It's the local share of the local state partnership to fund K through 12. It's the largest share of your local government budget. It's also the largest share of your state government budget. Additionally, counties get about a fourth of property taxes. It pays for all things county, county administration, county sheriff, county roads. Special districts in the blue there get about 20%. That pays for fire district, ambulance district, emergency services district, library district, rec district, all special districts. So again, property taxes are all about funding local services. Additionally, to understand Gallagher, you have to understand how property tax is calculated, which is a very simple two-step formula. Your property tax bill is simply the assessed value of your property. So like your house, and the assessed value of the property is simply the market value of your property, the base property value, times the appropriate assessment rate for your class of property. And we put those assessment rates in the Constitution in 1982. No property is taxed at 100% of its value. All property is taxed at 29% of its market value. Skyscrapers downtown, small businesses, vacant land, industrial property, ag land, all taxed at 29% of market value, except houses. And this is where the Gallagher Amendment uniquely impacts our property tax formula, because Gallagher taxes residential property on a formula which is currently about 7.15% of the house's market value. So you take the market value of your property times the appropriate assessment rate for that class property to arrive at the assessed value. And then you simply multiply that by the number of mills that the voters in your district have approved to fund all local services. One mill that voters approve generates $1 for every $1,000 of assessed value. So I'll put some numbers to this. You can kind of see how it works. If you had a $500,000 house, well, the Constitution says that residential property is taxed at 7.15%. It was 7.2 last year. It's 7.15 now. So the assessed value of your $500,000 house is $36,000. That's how much of your house is actually subject to be taxed. And if you live in a 60 mill district, which is fairly typical, each mill generates $1 per $1,000 of assessed value. So 60 times 36, the annual tax bill on your $500,000 house is $2,160. And that pays for that pie chart of services. So half that $2,160 pays the local share of K through 12, a fourth pays for all county services, 20% pays for all special districts. Where did Gallagher come from? Well, the legislature referred the Gallagher Amendment to voters in 1982. And at that time, of all the property in the state, houses in Grand Junction, skyscrapers in downtown Denver, farmland in Sterling, businesses in Durango, all property in the state, houses statewide made up about 45% of total value. And the Gallagher Amendment simply said that's a good ratio. Let's keep it forever. And so when we adopted the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, we froze in time that forevermore houses would never represent more or less than about 45% of total statewide valuation. Why did the legislature refer Gallagher? Well, if you were here in the 70s, you know that we saw some fairly significant population growth. Colorado had kind of been discovered as an international ski destination. We thought that that was kind of an anomaly, that population growth, and it turns out that it was not an anomaly, that Colorado had indeed been discovered, and we've seen 40 years of pretty significant population growth. And all those people moving to Colorado has understandably inflated the value of residential property in the state. This chart just shows going back to 1983, after we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, how residential property in the blue has far outpaced the growth in value of non-residential property in the brown. Residential property has grown every year since 1983, with the exception of the brief 4-year window during the national subprime mortgage crisis. But other than that, whether it's regardless of the economy, residential values have grown. So much so that today, residential property in the state represents 80% of total value of all property. And everything else represents 20%. So skyscrapers, small businesses, vacant land, industrial property, agriculture land, everything else is just 20%. But when we adopted the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, we said that's not possible. That can't happen. Houses can only represent 45% of the total value. So how does your legislature make 80% equal 45% to comply with your constitutional mandate? Well, you have to go back to our formula. If Gallagher says that the assessed value of houses across the state can only constitute 45% of total statewide property valuation, and the market value of houses is rising faster than the market value of everything else, the only way to keep houses at 45% is to shrink the assessment rate for houses, how much of each house is actually subject to taxation. And so that's what we've done for 35 years. Prior to the adoption of the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, all property in the state was taxed at 30% of its market value. When we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, it immediately dropped residential's assessment rate to 21% and then put it on a formula that has consistently gone down ever since. And today we're at about 7.15% of market value for houses, while everything else is fixed at 29%. And here's just some numbers to kind of see what that looks like. In 1981, before the Gallagher Amendment, if you had a $300,000 house, 30% of it was subject to taxation. If you lived in a 60 mil district, your property tax bill annually was about $5,400 to pay for all those local services. Today, if you have a $300,000 house, and I'm adjusting numbers here for inflation just to keep the math simple, but if you inflate the value of the house and the cost of the services, you arrive at the same place. But if you have a $300,000 house today, it's only taxed at 7.15%. If you live in the same 60 mil district, your tax bill has dropped in inflation adjusted dollars to just under $1,300, about a fourth of what it was 35 years ago. And that's happened on every house in the state. And so that has eroded that property tax base that funds all those local services. Gallagher requires that every 2 years, the legislature has to reassess the value of residential versus non-residential property and make an appropriate adjustment, if necessary, in the residential assessment rate to maintain that 45% ratio. So the big question this year is, as we're doing that calculation, is well, how will Gallagher affect the residential assessment rate in 2021, next year? And that calculation will be based on two factors. It will be based on the change in total market value of residential property over the last 2 years and the change in total market value of non-residential property over the last 2 years. If residential growth over the last 2 years hasn't grown any faster than non-residential, then Gallagher won't mandate any change in the residential assessment rate. But if residential values have grown relative to non-residential over the last 2 years, then Gallagher will again require the residential assessment rate to go down to maintain that 45% ratio. Conversely, if non-residential property has grown faster than residential in the last 2 years, then as it was intended, Gallagher would say that the residential assessment rate has to go up. But that can't happen because 10 years after we adopted Gallagher into the Constitution, we adopted the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which prohibits any tax from going up without a statewide vote of the people. So in that scenario, the residential assessment rate would just stay flat. So again, looking at this chart that we looked at earlier, the big question is, over the last 2 years, has residential property outgrown non-residential property proportionately? And we're going to blow this chart up to just look at the last 10 years since 2009, just so we can get a better look at it. So this is that same chart going back to 2009. And obviously, residential property has grown. When we look at the 2-year assessment of residential values, that process will look at the 2-year window going back to July of 2018, which you see shaded here on the right. And obviously, values have grown. And even though we've had a recession since March or April of this year, which will impact about 3 or 4 months of that 24-month window, that is not going to have any impact on the value of residential property. We have seen the recession has slowed the sale of residential property to some degree, but it has not reduced the value. And therefore, we fully expect that the valuation of residential property in this current 2-year assessment is going to peg residential values statewide at an all-time high, north of $900 billion. When we look at the brown line and the value of non-residential property, there's 2 categories of non-residential property that are affected differently by the recession's timeline. So we're going to look at those separately. Commercial buildings make up about 55% of non-residential value. And we'll look at that separate from all other non-residential property, which is primarily oil and gas production. Commercial buildings will be valued on the same 2-year window that residential property is, going back to July of 2018. And given that rental rates for commercial buildings are the primary driver of commercial value, and given that 20% of all commercial rental space in downtown Denver is rented to oil and gas companies, and considering we've been in an oil crash since January or December, that's going to have some downward pressure on commercial values. Additionally, we've had this recession since March or April, which affects 3 or 4 months of that 24-month window. And even though the recession has not impacted the value of houses, it has impacted the value of commercial buildings. And so we expect that commercial buildings, which make up about 55% of non-residential value, we expect they're going to be valued between 4 to 6% less in this next 2-year calculation. When we look at all other non-residential property outside of commercial buildings, and we're talking primarily about oil and gas production here, makes up about 40% of this category, that other non-residential property won't be valued on a 24-month window. It'll be valued on the 12-month window of 2020. And therefore, the recession that occurred in March or April of this year will have a much more significant adverse impact on the valuation of other non-residential property, because it makes up about 9 months of that 12-month window. And of course, additionally, we've had the oil crash for the entirety of this year. And so given that 40% of other non-residential is oil and gas production, we can expect other non-residential to also be valued 4 to 6% less than it was 2 years ago. And when you add that to the drop in commercial value, we can expect about a 10% drop in total non-residential value. So when you look at that chart that we looked at earlier, we expect, again, about a $900 billion valuation of residential property in the blue, all-time high, and maybe a 10% drop in non-residential. And so the question that we asked earlier, the answer is yes, residential property has indeed outpaced the growth of non-residential over the last 2 years, and rather significantly. And how that will dictate that the Gallagher will dictate that the residential assessment rate therefore has to go down to maintain that 45% ratio. And how much it goes down depends on those valuations. So in 2019, when you look at those 2 columns in the brown, the actual market value of all non-residential property in the state was about $224 billion. And non-residential values have an assessed value, property tax value, of about 32% on average. And so that amounted to about $73 billion statewide last year. Compared to residential in the blue last year, total market value was about $873 billion. And the assessed value of that, again, is calculated per the Gallagher Amendment. The assessed value can be no more than about 45% of total. So if the assessed value of non-residential was $73 billion, Gallagher dictated that the assessed value of residential could be no more than $62 billion. And therefore, the assessment rate had to drop from 7.2 to 7.15 last year. So for this year, based on the charts we just looked at, we're estimating a 10% drop in the value of non-residential property in the current 2-year assessment, down to about $200 billion. And at 32% assessed valuation, that amounts to about $64 billion statewide. Residential values, if you remember, we estimated that that would be an all-time high, market value north of $900 billion. And again, Gallagher says the assessed value of residential property can be no more than 45% of total. So if the assessed value of non-residential is estimated to be 64 billion, then Gallagher says the assessed value of residential can only be about $52 billion, which means to arrive at that number, the residential assessment rate must drop again to below 6%, which will be about a 19% drop in the residential assessment rate, which is fairly significant. When you look at how that has dropped over time, a 19% drop proportionately to where we are today versus where we have been is fairly significant. How that will affect you depends on where you live. And more specifically, it depends on how much of your county's tax base relies on residential property for its valuation. Obviously, those counties that rely on residential property more for their tax base are going to be more adversely impacted by a 19% drop in the residential assessment rate. This chart just shows a sampling of different counties to kind of show the disparity there in the center column of how different counties rely differently on residential property for their tax base. Counties like Adams, Chaffee, Elbert, Jefferson, Mesa County, they rely fairly heavily on residential property, upwards of 60% in Jefferson County, almost 70% in Elbert County, and therefore in the column on the right, their revenues will suffer more based on a 19% drop in the residential assessment rate, up to 10 and 13% in the case of Elbert County. And that drop in their revenue is really a permanent cut, because even though the economy will recover and market values will grow accordingly, the residential assessment rate cannot recover. It can't go back up again per Tabor without a statewide vote of the people, which has never happened. And so counties will be forced to deal with this permanent cut in the residential assessment rate, and they'll really have three options. Number one, they can just permanently reduce services to balance their budget, or they can go to their voters and ask voters to raise the local mill levy just enough to offset Gallagher's forced reduction in the residential assessment rate and sustain their tax base. And oftentimes voters will approve an increase in the mill levy, because if you're a homeowner, it doesn't cost you anything, because even though you're paying on more mills, you're paying at a lower assessment rate. So it's a wash. But remember that every other class of property, so think of small businesses here, is taxed at a fixed rate of 29%. So every time voters vote to raise their local mill levy to offset Gallagher's forced reduction of the residential rate, that's a real tax increase for every other class property and business owners, because they're paying on more mills on a fixed tax rate of 29%. So every time we do that, that shifts the tax burden from residential owners to business owners. And the third option would be that counties and taxing jurisdictions can simply cross their fingers and kind of hope that when the economy rebounds, the market value of houses will grow enough to offset Gallagher's reduction in the residential assessment rate. Even though the assessment rate won't grow, market values may grow. And that does happen to some degree in areas where we see fast growth in market value of houses, like the Front Range in the metropolitan area. But it doesn't really happen in rural areas, and therefore rural areas are quite unintentionally and unfortunately disadvantaged and impacted more adversely by the Gallagher Amendment, because they suffer the same reduction in the statewide residential assessment rate and an erosion of their tax base, but they don't enjoy the rebound in market values later on. And this chart just shows how the tax burden has shifted from homeowners to businesses since we've adopted the Gallagher Amendment. Again, every time voters vote to raise their local mill levy to sustain their tax base, that shifts that tax burden to businesses. In 1983, when we had a 21% residential assessment rate in the columns there on the left, for every dollar that homeowners paid in property tax in the blue, businesses paid $1.40 on the same value of property. Today, in 2020, we're at a 7.15% residential assessment rate, which means for every dollar that homeowners pay in property tax, businesses pay a little over $4 on the same value of property. If Gallagher forces the residential assessment rate to drop below 6%, as we expect next year, for every dollar that homeowners pay, businesses will then pay $5. And so that burden has been shifted fairly significantly, and it's starting to create a problem for small business. So the lesson we've learned from all of this is that you can't get something for nothing. If you have the Gallagher Amendment, the obvious winner is homeowners who pay less property tax consistently, and it continues to go down. The loser, obviously, is local service providers based on the erosion of that tax base and the public at large that depends on those services. And if we ask voters to raise their local mill levy just to sustain that tax base, the winner is local service providers and the public at large that enjoys those services, but the loser is businesses who have to assume a larger and larger share of the property tax burden. So there's no easy answer, and there's no free lunch. So in conclusion, the Gallagher Amendment will continue to erode the residential tax rate as we go forward and the corresponding tax base that funds local services, as long as residential values continue to outpace non-residential. And rural communities, quite unintentionally, will suffer the worst erosion of their tax base than metro communities. And any effort by local taxing jurisdictions to get voters to raise local mill levies to combat this erosion of the tax base will continue to contribute to that shift in the tax burden from homeowners to businesses. And finally, because this is in the Constitution, we adopted it in 1982. If the voters want any change in this policy, they really have to do it themselves, because the legislature can't amend the Constitution. Only the voters can. Which brings me to the ballot measure at hand. Last year, as Pat mentioned, Building a Better Colorado hosted a statewide conversation on constitutional fiscal policy and the Gallagher Amendment. We targeted 1,800 civic leaders in 37 communities and talked for a couple hours about the reality of our situation and asked them what they thought we should do. And as concerns the Gallagher Amendment, we looked at about 5 different policy options, beginning with the option of doing nothing, because BBCO doesn't advocate for change. We just talk about the reality. And obviously the option of doing nothing there on the left was not very popular. The most popular option was to repeal the Gallagher Amendment, and 72% of the 1,800 civic leaders recommended that. It was really a bipartisan support, 73% of Democrats, 66% of Republicans, 70% unaffiliated. And we've published a report of this and wrapped up our statewide conversation last year. And subsequent to that, your legislature has now referred that idea to your ballot with similar bipartisan support. I think almost 80%, 78 out of 100 legislators supported this referred measure that you'll see on your ballot. And the proposed ballot measure will do 3 things. Number 1, it will repeal the Gallagher Amendment, which takes that formula out of the Constitution, that 45-55 requirement, which will stop the continued formulaic erosion of the residential assessment rate. Additionally, it will remove the reference in the Constitution to a 21% residential assessment rate, which was the baseline residential assessment rate that was established in 1982. They have to remove that, or else the residential assessment rate would jump back up to 21%, which we don't want. So the combination of these 2 things will essentially freeze the residential assessment rate at 7.15 forever, just as commercial rates have been frozen at 29%, unless the voters decide at some point in the future to raise it. The third thing that the measure will do is it will remove all those assessment rates, which I shared with you on that table. It'll remove all those assessment rates for each class property out of the Constitution, which means they'll only be found in statute. And the net effect of that is that the legislature is in charge of statutes. So this will empower the legislature to once again be responsible for setting assessment rates. And Tabor says they can't raise any assessment rate without a statewide vote of the people. But what they could potentially do is lower an assessment rate on any class of property at some point in the future if they had the support of the legislature to do that. And lastly, I just note that I've been asked a lot about, well, how will repealing Gallagher affect my tax rate on my house? And again, repealing the Gallagher Amendment doesn't affect your tax rate at all. It doesn't raise it or lower it for your house or any other class of property for that matter. All repealing Gallagher does is remove the formulaic erosion that will continue to drive that tax rate on your house lower. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pat and questions. I have our website up here, buildingabettercolorado.org. A recorded version of this presentation is on there, as well as a bunch of other material. I have my email address there as well, reeves@betterco.org. And I'm going to stop sharing, Pat, and be happy to answer any questions.
Great, Reeves. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. I think the best way to handle questions would be, if you have a question, to just indicate in the chat that you have a question. You don't have to write it out, but just indicate that you have one so I can call on you in order. It'll prevent us from from having a crosstalk issue. There were a couple that were sent in, since Seth is having some microphone issues, I'll go ahead and read Seth's question up. And his question, will start it off, is he says, Reeves, I know you did research on Tabor and Amendment number 23. Can you briefly advise the consensus sentiments expressed from those meetings?
Yes. So in our statewide conversation last year, we talked about the 3 constitutional fiscal amendments that we put into the Constitution over the last 35 years. That'd be Gallagher, Tabor, and Amendment 23. And the consensus outcome of that, as concerns Gallagher, was to repeal Gallagher. As concerns Tabor, the recommendation was to remove the revenue limit of Tabor, but keep the requirement that citizens approve any tax increase. And then as concerns Amendment 23, which is the K-12 funding mandate, there wasn't strong consensus on what we should do. There was strong agreement that it's a problem and contributes to our constitutional fiscal quagmire, but the recommendation was deal with Tabor and Gallagher first, and then once we've got that cleaned up, then let's talk about Amendment 23.
Okay, great. Next question was, does this include residential, does residential include multifamily but not hotels?
Correct. Yes, it does. Residential is anything where people stay more than 30 days. So whether it's a single family home, a rental duplex, 1-story duplex, a 37-story high rise, it doesn't matter. It's all residential.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat.
I see there was some question about the millions reference.
Okay.
Slide was, it was millions, but the number was in thousands. So thousands, millions, the total is billions. We just couldn't fit all the zeros on there.
Gotcha. Well, I'll open it up since it doesn't look like we'll have much crosstalk in the questions. Does anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask?
I just want to thank you for the presentation, Reeves. This is very, very informative. Really good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, be careful not to talk about this too much at your next holiday party, because no one will want to stand around you if you're talking fiscal policy. It's just, you'll be labeled a policy nerd and no one will ever talk to you again.
It's better than most politics nowadays anyway.
That's true. It's very complicated. It's very complicated. And these issues are not front of mind for most people. And that's part of the challenge that we have as a state. I'm going to get a little in the weeds here, but there's a reason that our founding fathers did not create a democracy. They created a republic. We don't all make decisions on every policy. We elect people who dedicate themselves a significant part of their lives to make those decisions. And the reason we have a republic is same reason we require a medical license for doctors, right? And a law license to practice is we don't want everybody operating on people and practicing law. You have to be qualified. And so in a republic, the theory is that we have people who are dedicated to really understanding the complexity of these issues and making the decisions and negotiating the best answer for public policy. And but we also have the opportunity to amend the Constitution with citizen initiatives, which we have done over the last 35 years with these 3 fiscal amendments. And there are consequences, unintended consequences to every policy change. But when it's in the Constitution, legislature can't do anything about it. And it's kind of created, the interaction of those 3 policies has created several unintended consequences that are affecting our quality of life. And again, only the voters can do anything about it if they want to. And yet the voters are, on average, are probably the least qualified to really understand the complexities of these issues. And so it has been a challenge. And that's why Building a Better Colorado very deliberately, we didn't target average voters in our statewide conversation. We targeted thought leaders like you all who really engage and who really understand better the complexity of these issues. And I think it's going to take those same thought leaders talking to people across the state to elicit any kind of change if they want to.
And we do have a couple of other questions before we get to Guyleen's question. We did have a couple of folks, Reeves, that asked if the slides are publicly available or can be shared.
I will email this deck to you, Pat, as soon as we're done, and you're happy to share it. Absolutely.
Great. Awesome. And so the question comes from Guyleen. Go ahead.
Hi, Reeves. This is Guyleen. I'm also the mayor pro tem for Broomfield, and I attended those sessions in the governor's carriage house and learned so much. And I'm really appreciative that we're finally seeing one of the outcomes happen. As you might or may not know, Broomfield is one of 8 counties that are also running a local revenue stabilization measure to adjust the mill levy should the RAR drop. And I was wondering if you had any input on, like, how do we locally help educate voters on, a local initiative?
Well, a couple of thoughts. Again, I really think I so much appreciate your leadership on this guy thing, because again, I really think it's incumbent on local leaders who may or may not have a title, but there are people in every community that have influence who are involved, and it's incumbent on those people to really reach out to others to raise awareness, because I believe that when it comes to voting on policy issues, public policy issues, if it's a social issue like gay marriage or abortion or marijuana or something like that, people have opinions on stuff like that. Whether they're informed or not, they have strong opinions. And but on esoteric issues like constitutional fiscal policy, people have no clue. The average, no clue. They don't even know how to spell Constitution. And so they oftentimes will turn to people like yourself and Seth and Pat and others and say, what is this? What do I do? And so I really think this is going to be a word of mouth issue. The message that there is a campaign that is formed now to pursue passage of this measure to repeal Gallagher. They're expected to launch, I hear, next week. And I believe their message is going to be, it's going to be a very dumbed down version, but it's going to be all about the importance of funding local services, the unfairness of the adverse impact to rural communities. The poorest communities of our state are suffering the worst because of this, and the unfairness of the shift in the property tax burden. It's all formulaically driven in the Constitution. And so it'll be a very simple message, but at the end of the day, I think the average voter is going to hear that message, and then he's going to turn to Guy Lee, his neighbor, and say, what do you think? So thank you for hosting this.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to the Chamber for helping to educate our business community, which I agree, it's an unfair burden with these formulas baked into the Constitution that puts the primary tax burden on our businesses. But yet we have an obligation to provide these services that everyone loves, yet people won't miss it till they're gone. And I guess that's part of the educational process. Some of the counties are actually listing the services that would be cut first in their ballot questions. They're calling it a services stabilization measure in Summit, for example, and what programs would be defunded. Like Los Animas County had to close their county offices, I think, to 3 days a week. They couldn't afford to stay open. That's how bad it got. And that's what I got involved with, is to prevent that type of situation here in Broomfield.
And the stabilization measure, I haven't seen Broomfield's, but I assume it's a kind of what they call a de-Gallerization that allows the mill levy to automatically up to offset future erosion. And again, I refer back to that slide where there's no free lunch, because the does help fix the problem for local service providers. It does help sustain that tax base automatically, but it also puts on autopilot the shift in the property tax burden to the business community. So
even if the commercial property tax values decrease?
No, but they can't decrease unless you take it out of the cost. So if we pass this measure, then the legislature will be empowered to potentially lower commercial rates if they ever did. I don't know that would be a heavy lift in and of itself. But if you don't do that, then de-Gallerization just puts on autopilot that shift. But I don't know what else you do. There's a lot of taxing that are pursuing that. That's the best option for public service.
I agree. Well, thank you very much.
We do have another question. Heidi Henkel, one of our city council members, has a question. Heidi, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Reeves. Thank you for your presentation, and
Yes.
thank you all for being here. I'm just wondering, what was the original intention behind the formula? I would really like to kind of hear a little bit of history on that. I was born and raised here, but at the same time, I was quite young, I'm sure, and not understanding it at that time. But I just want to understand, because every time we make new laws, I'm always curious, are we causing more problems down the road? And so I think anytime we make new laws, I think we need to really document what is our intention behind it. So I can understand our intention behind this. I just want to understand the intention behind the original formula.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Again, all policy has unintended consequences, and that's why I'm a big advocate of keeping policy, fiscal policy in statute, which allows us to duck and jab over time and change it as necessary. Whereas if it's in the Constitution, we're kind of, it's more difficult to change. But if you go back mentally, back in the 70s, which puts me in 4th grade, if you go back then, Colorado was really kind of discovered in the 70s. I mean, population has been growing since 50s, but the ski areas really came online in the whole industry of skiing in the 70s. And so the people really started moving here. And so we saw a lot of population growth, and therefore residential values were going up. They just were. And as values go up, so too does your tax bill. Your tax rate doesn't go up, but the proportion of the market value, right? And so as people were seeing their values go up, they're very excited to see the equity in their house, but they're not excited to see the corresponding tax bill. And so they're calling their legislators. Somebody's got to do something about this. And in past years, the residential share of total property valuation has grown. It used to be down, a fourth of all property in the state was residential, and then 30%, and then 35%. And in 1982, it had grown to 45% of total market value statewide. And we just never expected it to grow so much, residential property. And that is why they adopted the Gallagher Amendment. They was like, well, we got to stop this. It's 45%. We have to stop this. And obviously, it was a pretty easy sell to the voters. We're going to lower your assessment rate from 30% to 21%. But it was also a fairly easy sell to commercial property owners too, because we're going to lower your rate from 30 to fix it at 29. So it sounded pretty good. Nobody ever anticipated in 1982 that Colorado's population would grow at that rate and even faster for the next 40 years. We just didn't see it. And nobody, I'm pretty sure, ever would have thought that residential property in the state would grow to be 80% of total valuation. It just, you don't know what you don't know. And that's where we are today. And I think Gallagher has done what it was intended to do, which is prevent homeowners' share of the tax bill from growing. But because of population growth, it has done even more than that. It has dramatically reduced the residential share of the tax bill by dramatically increasing the tax bill burden on everybody else. And we have, I think, now the 3rd lowest residential property tax in the nation, I believe, which funds public services. So here we are, no free lunch.
Yeah, that kind of, it's interesting to see that, statewide, and then seeing how much each county relies on residential tax. So it's interesting. It's like a blanket answer to a county question. So
one of the policy options we talked about last year, which the legislature had also considered, was the idea of what if you were to regionalize that tax rate so that each county would have a different assessment rate on property. But the challenge with that is then that creates then that recreates the problem we have with different sales taxes across the state and businesses trying to navigate that. And so there's pros and cons to each proposal. But the real tragedy, I think, of how Gallagher has evolved is that if you know Dennis Gallagher, former Senator Gallagher, great guy, very, very, very astute, sharp as a tack today. Nobody cares more about Colorado's disadvantaged populations than Dennis Gallagher. And it's just such an ironic tragedy that the populations that have been most adversely impacted by the Gallagher Amendment are communities like the San Luis Valley, where they have so little commercial tax base, and it's just in Los Animas, it's just wiping out the service, the tax base in those communities, and it's just an ironic twist.
Yeah, I think Erie might be running into the same issues. You know, they have a lot of residential, but very little commercial. And they bend over backwards just to get a King Supers there.
Yep.
So yeah, it seems like either there was either a miscommunication from that law to the counties, or there needs to be like a better direction. But this sounds really good. Hopefully people will listen to it and understand the constraints that we're running into. Thank you. That's it.
Bedroom communities like Erie and Albert County. I mean, that's Albert County, same thing. We saw how much they depend on residential, almost 70%, because it's a bedroom community. And so their residential growth is happening so much faster than their commercial growth. And Erie, same thing. All these bedroom communities are getting more and more overweighted on the residential side, which makes them much more vulnerable to a reduction in the residential rate.
Reeves, one of the things that I noticed on the slides, and if you wouldn't mind reiterating it, I think this is one of the important pieces. If the Gallagher Amendment is repealed, the tax rate doesn't immediately shoot back up. It holds at that 7.15. Am I understanding that correctly?
You are correct, but in order to do that, not only do they have to repeal the Gallagher formula, they also have to repeal that 21% reference, because if all they do is take out the formula, then the only rate left, it's not a formulaic rate anymore, the only rate left is 21%, which was put in 82, and nobody wants it to jump to 21. So they have to take that out. And the combination of taking both the original 21% reference out and the formula means, well, there's no reference in the Constitution anymore to what the residential rate is. So what is it? And then you have to go to statute, because statute mirrors the Constitution in this regard. So the rate is 7.15 per statute, which would be in the purview of the legislature.
So are those two separate issues on the ballot, or is that all encompassed in the one issue?
All under one. It all fit under the single subject rule, one ballot measure.
Okay. And I think Guyleen has another question.
Oh, can't hear
Elaine, you're on mute. Sorry, baby.
You think I'd have that down by now. I'm sorry, y'all. I read somewhere that Dennis Gallagher actually realizes now that this is having some unintended consequences and that there is a need for change. Did you read that as well?
Well, before we launched our statewide conversation last year, it was a 5-month conversation in 37 communities. I made the point to go over and visit with Dennis. I had coffee in his living room, and I said, "Senator, we're going to be talking about your amendment." He was quick to say, "It's not my amendment. It's actually Ron's amendment." And Ron Stewart, his colleague, but Dennis's name is on it. But my sense was, and I won't put words in Dennis's mouth, but my sense was that Dennis absolutely recognizes this has gone a direction that he never anticipated and did not intend. He's also quick to say, but it's not just Gallagher. Tabor is a problem too, which I agree with. I think the combination of the two. He stopped short of saying, and I think we ought to repeal the Gallagher Amendment, but I've talked to him since, and yeah, I think he's quick to say this has gone a direction I didn't intend, but he's also saying we need to keep the Gallagher Amendment, I think. And there's people that have said, yeah, it's both Tabor and Gallagher, and it's a little bit Amendment 23, as Seth noted, and some people have said, let's do all three. Well, you can't fit all that under one ballot measure per the same single subject rule, and so you got to start somewhere. And here, up to this point, in broad brushstrokes here, if I can describe that, the proponents who want to change Tabor on the left, those on the right say, no, don't do that till we fix Gallagher. And then the left says, well, we don't want to fix Gallagher until we fix Tabor. It's like, come on, Colorado. Yeah, we've got to hold hands, and we got to work on this. And that's why I'm so encouraged to see this consensus idea, this bipartisan idea, now be on the ballot. And it's on the ballot with almost 80% support from the legislature. I don't know when the legislature 80% on anything. So that's encouraging. This is, to me, is how policy ought to happen. You ought to sit people down, intelligent community leaders from all walks of life, and engage them in a constructive dialogue. And then that idea ought to appear on their ballot, and the legislature ought to support it in a strong bipartisan fashion. And we've done that, and then the people might adopt it. We'll see. I don't know.
Do you know of any opposition to it?
Yes.
Formal?
Not organizationally. I know There's one person out there I know spoke strongly against it, and that's Michael Fields, formerly with AFP, Americans for Prosperity, and now he started a group called Colorado Rising Action. I know he's speaking against it because he calls it a property tax increase. It doesn't increase the rates. It will increase your residential bill to the extent the value of your house grows if this passes. I've heard John Caldera with Independence Institute has written about it against it. And of course, Dennis has, Dennis Imra and Stewart, who really crafted it, both have, I've heard, spoken against it. But I haven't heard any organizations.
Are there any other questions from anyone? All right, I don't see any in the in the chat, and not hearing anyone raise their hand or seeing any hands raised. Reeves, any parting words for us?
No, just thank you. Thank you so much to the Broomfield Chamber. It's just, honestly, it is, I'm just absolutely convinced in the increasing importance of our community leaders to really step up and lead our state in this advent of a social media world where information is so free and so shallow. Oftentimes people are prone to make decisions based on emotion increasingly. I think it's going to get more so that way, and that is really dangerous for public policy. And I just think it is so increasingly incumbent on community leaders like the chamber to educate those who are willing to engage and sit down and talk and learn through the chamber's dialogues, and then reach out to their own networks and make them aware, because people will listen to people they know and trust. And absent that, they'll listen to the next 30-second soundbite or 160-character snippet they see on Twitter. And that's not always the best place for information. Thank you so much. I'll send you a copy of these slides, Pat.
Perfect, and I will distribute those to the folks that are on this call. And so with that, we want to thank Reeves so much for being a part of our education series today. We also want to make sure that we recognize one more time Sunflower Bank as our education partner for today's session. We really appreciate everything that they have done to help us bring this series to you. Did want to let you know of a couple of other things that are coming up for the chamber, coming up from our oh, we lost it again. Let me go back to that one more time. We've got some upcoming things on our calendar. Next Thursday, our education series will be Preparing Your Finances for Uncertain Times. Hope that everyone can join us for that. That will be presented by Millennial Wealth Management. September 16th, we have a business after hours mixer. It will be in person at Summit Financial Solutions. That's a primarily outdoor event, so we'd love to see faces at a safe and socially distant opportunity for us to get together in person again. September 24th, we have a candidate forum on the Colorado District House 33 race, or House District 33 race, I should say. And on September 29th, another candidate forum for the Colorado Senate District 23 race. We're looking forward to those as well. You can find information about all of our education sessions on our candidate forums at broomfieldchamber.com. There is an education session link right there on the homepage, and you can find out more information on how to get involved in all of that. So Reeves, thank you so much again for your time today, and for everyone that has had to join us on this webinar. We appreciate it. And again, we will send a recording of this out to everybody so you can view it again and grab extra information from it. So for the Chamber of Commerce, I'm Pat Monticelli. We appreciate everybody, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.